The end of World War II in 1945 left Europe in a state of devastation and uncertainty, as the conflict had stretched the continent's economies and resources to their breaking point. With the cessation of active combat, a new set of challenges emerged, not related to military strategy, but to the enormous surplus of war material left behind. Among the most pressing concerns were the thousands of Allied tanks, scattered across the landscapes of France, Belgium, Germany, and beyond, their fates uncertain and varied. These tanks, once symbols of power and technological advancement, had been built for a war that had drawn to a close. With hostilities ended, they became more of a logistical burden than a military asset. Thousands of machines, from the formidable American Sherman to the British Churchill, now sat idle, often abandoned in fields, forests, or hastily constructed depots. The sheer number of these vehicles made the task of managing their post-war disposition monumental. The Allies, particularly the United States, had poured vast amounts of industrial effort into producing tanks at an unprecedented scale. In 1944 alone, the U.S. produced over 30,000 tanks, while the British manufactured several thousand more. Yet, by the war's end, many of these tanks had no place in the post-war order. The economic pressure to transition from a wartime to a peacetime economy was immense. In the wake of the war, Europe was economically devastated. The war had drained national treasuries, and the cost of maintaining vast military stockpiles of tanks, many of which were now obsolete, was unsustainable. With the focus shifting from military production to rebuilding war-torn cities and economies, the tanks were soon regarded as a luxury few could afford to keep. Their upkeep required significant resources, fuel, parts, and trained personnel that Europe simply no longer had. Initial decisions were made quickly and with little fanfare. The United States, having the largest surplus of military vehicles, was the first to begin the process of reducing its vast stockpiles. Many tanks were left in Europe, as it would have been cost-prohibitive to transport them back to the U.S. Most of these were considered surplus to requirements. They had already fulfilled their purpose in combat, and there was no longer a need for them in a post-war world. The tanks were left to deteriorate, often unattended, as the Allies began their transition to peacetime operations. One of the most immediate actions taken was the scrapping of large numbers of these tanks. It was a necessary decision, driven by the prohibitive costs of storage, maintenance, and the lack of usable space for such large military machinery. By the time the war ended, the Allies had accumulated vast stockpiles of war material that simply could not be kept. In Germany, for example, the United States scrapped over 1,000 Sherman tanks alone in the immediate years following the war. These tanks, many of which had seen action on the front lines, were stripped of their usable parts and recycled for scrap metal. In France, a similar fate befell thousands of tanks, most of which had been left behind in the rush to move on to post-war recovery. The process of dismantling these vehicles was often slow and laborious, involving the extraction of valuable materials like steel, which could be repurposed for civilian industry. Yet, scrapping was not always the solution. In many cases, the sheer number of tanks meant that not all could be dealt with immediately. In some instances, tanks were left abandoned in open fields or stored in vast depots, often forgotten for years. These vehicles were in limbo, no longer needed for combat, but too expensive to maintain. In some locations, such as the vast former German military depots, hundreds of tanks were left to rust in the open air, left as relics of a past that no one could afford to continue. The conditions in which these tanks were stored contributed to their rapid deterioration, with some becoming little more than metal husks, their engines long defunct, and their tracks buried in overgrowth. The scale of the problem was staggering. The United States alone had approximately 100,000 military vehicles stationed in Europe at the war's end. Not all of these were tanks, but the sheer number of armored vehicles, including trucks and personnel carriers, added to the logistical nightmare of managing such vast quantities of surplus material. Even as these tanks began to disappear, their disposal was a slow process. In many regions, they remained a part of the landscape for years, marking the end of an era and the uncertainty of what the post-war world would look like. Another complicating factor was the presence of tanks that were not yet obsolete, but which had become surplus due to shifting military priorities. Some of these vehicles, such as the British Comet or the American M26 Pershing, were more advanced and could have been retained for use in future conflicts. Yet, with Europe in ruins and a wary peace settling over the continent, the cost of maintaining large armored fleets was deemed unnecessary. These tanks, still in relatively good condition, were often sold off to other nations, where they could be repurposed for various needs. In some cases, they found their way into the hands of new governments or resistance movements, though often with little in the way of support or spare parts. In addition to these international sales, some tanks were sent to various locations for use in peacekeeping operations or repurposed for civilian roles. While rare, there were instances of tanks being converted into bulldozers, tractors, or other machinery useful for post-war reconstruction. These vehicles, stripped of their military armament, would be given new roles in a world trying to rebuild from the destruction of war. In some cases, tanks were even turned into monuments, symbolic of the end of the war, but it was clear that they were no longer relevant to the military needs of the post-war era. The United States and Britain also faced the challenge of their own war industries. The production of tanks had been one of the most important aspects of the wartime economy, and in the aftermath of the war, the shift to peacetime production was not without its own difficulties. The factories that had once churned out tanks now found themselves having to adapt to the production of civilian goods. While this transition was vital for economic recovery, it meant that the mass production of tanks came to an immediate halt. The factories that had once operated at full capacity now faced an uncertain future. For the workers who had been part of the wartime manufacturing efforts, this change marked the end of an era. The loss of jobs, the shift in focus, and the uncertainty of the post-war economic landscape left many struggling to find their place in a world that no longer needed the machines of war. Yet, as tanks were scrapped, abandoned, and repurposed, there were also moments of tragedy. In some instances, the loss of these vehicles marked the end of their service lives, but for others, their fate was more unsettling. Some tanks had been left in parts of Europe where they had been stationed during the war, forgotten by all but those who had been involved in their deployment. Over time, the rusty hulks of these tanks became silent monuments to a conflict that had taken so much and left so many questions unanswered. And so, the fate of the thousands of tanks left scattered across Europe unfolded in a way that seemed as uncertain as the future of the continent itself. Some were destroyed, others repurposed, but many, still, remained forgotten relics of a war that had reshaped the world, their future as uncertain as the world that had brought them into being. As the years passed, the fate of the thousands of Allied tanks left scattered across Europe became a story of gradual disappearance, economic pragmatism, and historical erasure. While some vehicles found new purposes, either being sold to smaller nations or repurposed for civilian use, the majority were dismantled, left to decay, or lost to time altogether. For a continent already devastated by war, these tanks were not merely military relics. They were symbols of the immense scale of destruction that had swept through Europe. Their slow eradication highlighted the broader post-war struggle, a race to rebuild and redefine Europe's place in the world, all while dealing with the remnants of a conflict that had shattered its very foundation. One of the first long-term decisions regarding the fate of these vehicles came in the form of large-scale sales programs. As Allied nations sought to transition to peacetime economies, some surplus military hardware was seen as a possible source of revenue. The U.S. government, in particular, turned to the War Surplus Sales Program, which allowed both private entities and foreign governments to purchase military equipment that was no longer needed. For tanks, this was a double-edged sword. While many of the older models were quickly sold off to emerging nations, especially in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, this was not a comprehensive solution. The vast majority of tanks, particularly those that had seen significant combat damage or had been in storage for years, were considered obsolete for any practical military use. In many cases, these surplus tanks were purchased by governments eager to bolster their own military capabilities with relatively inexpensive assets. For example, in the years following the war, a large number of Sherman tanks found their way to countries such as Israel, Greece, and South Korea. These nations, dealing with their own regional conflicts and limited resources, viewed these tanks as crucial to their defense needs, especially since they were relatively easy to maintain compared to more modern armored vehicles. However, this was a short-term solution at best. While these tanks served in various conflicts for a few more decades, their age and limitations were undeniable. Within a few years, most of the tanks that had been exported to these countries were either retired or scrapped due to the high costs of maintenance and the introduction of more advanced military technologies. But the number of surplus tanks was so overwhelming that these sales programs could not address the larger problem. In 1946, for instance, the U.S. Army had over 50,000 armored vehicles, and by the early 1950s, nearly half of these were still in Europe. There was simply no feasible way to transport them back to the U.S., where they would have had little to no practical use in peacetime. Even if they had been transported, the sheer cost of maintaining them for future use would have been prohibitive. As such, the overwhelming majority of these tanks remained on the continent, either in storage or abandoned in various locations. For those that remained in Europe, the next chapter in their life was one of abandonment and decay. Vast storage depots, often hastily constructed in the last days of the war, became the final resting places for thousands of tanks. These depots, often in rural areas far from major cities, were filled with rows upon rows of vehicles, some intact, others damaged beyond recognition. Many of these tanks had been left with their engines full of fuel, their tracks and wheels still in place, but with no one to operate or maintain them. Over time, as resources for upkeep dwindled, these tanks began to deteriorate. Exposure to the elements, rain, snow, and cold, led to rust and corrosion, and the mechanical systems of these once pristine machines became completely inoperable. In some instances, these storage sites became peculiar symbols of post-war Europe. They stood as stark reminders of the technological arms race that had driven the war effort and the subsequent, swift obsolescence of these once critical assets. As these tanks sat abandoned, many were stripped of their usable parts. The armor was often removed and sold off for scrap, while engines and other key components were cannibalized for other military or civilian uses. Over time, what remained were little more than hulks of rusted steel, scattered across Europe like forgotten pieces of history. The fields and forests where some of these tanks were abandoned became a bizarre and tragic archive of wartime production and military excess. In certain instances, abandoned tanks became something else entirely. With the decommissioning of these military machines, the emerging post-war economies began to repurpose some of the more intact vehicles for civilian use. This process was not widespread but was notable in some regions, where there was a pressing need for heavy machinery. Tanks were often converted into bulldozers, tractors, or other types of construction equipment. In these cases, the once formidable weapons of war became part of the rebuilding process. This was not always an easy transformation, however. The tanks had been built for combat, and adapting them to civilian roles required significant modification. Despite the difficulty, it was not uncommon for these repurposed tanks to serve in the reconstruction of Europe's shattered infrastructure, clearing debris and helping to rebuild roads, bridges, and buildings. However, the conversion of tanks into civilian machinery was relatively limited, as the costs associated with such modifications were often high. In the years following the war, the scrap metal trade became an essential part of Europe's economic recovery. As Europe began to rebuild its cities and industries, the need for raw materials, especially steel, was critical. Tanks, which were made of thick, durable steel, became valuable sources of this material. The process of scrapping these vehicles became a widespread practice, particularly in the late 1940s and early 1950s. By 1950, thousands of tanks had been stripped of their components and melted down to be reused in civilian manufacturing. This practice was a reflection of the larger post-war shift from military to civilian production, a necessary step in the rebuilding of a continent that had been ravaged by years of conflict. Yet, there were those who sought to preserve these tanks as monuments or memorials. As the scars of the war began to fade, some cities and towns chose to retain a few of the more iconic models as symbols of victory and remembrance. These tanks, often placed in prominent public spaces, were carefully preserved and maintained as historical artifacts. Some became part of museums or war memorials, where they stood as silent witnesses to the conflict that had shaped the world. However, even as these tanks were preserved, many more were quietly dismantled, forgotten, or lost to time. The tanks that were left to rust in depots or abandoned in fields slowly faded from public consciousness, their stories increasingly relegated to history.